Good evening and welcome to Skeptics in the Pub Online. I'm Kat from the Merseyside Skeptics Society and I'll be your host for the evening. If you're joining us for the first time, Skeptics in the Pub Online is a coalition of various skeptics in the pub groups from across the UK and Europe. We came together when the COVID pandemic meant that we couldn't have our monthly meetings in pubs. So now we talk regular meetings online on a variety of different topics that promote science, reason and critical thinking. For information about our future events, please find us on Facebook or Twitter or check out our website. That's SitP.online. The format for tonight is we will have our talk from our excellent guest speaker, then we will take a short break, followed by a question and answer session. If you would like to join in the Q&A, please go to sitp.online/ask to submit your questions or upvote any questions you'd like to see asked. Our lovely moderators will be dropping that link in the chat bar along with some other useful links throughout the night, including links to our Discord channel where you can chat to other skeptics and our YouTube channel where you can catch up on previous talks. Live closed captions are available throughout tonight's talk and through the Q&A session. After the Q&A, we will be opening up our virtual pub, the Lock-In's Razor, where you're welcome to join us for a chat and a drink of your choice. Now, bad news. Tonight, we were supposed to be joined by Michael Rothschild talking about the rise of QAnon. However, we've had to postpone that event, but we will be reorganising that event for a future date. So keep an eye on our website and our social media for details there. However, good news. Tonight, we're joined by our very own Michael Marshall, who, as well as being a member of the SitP-O organising team, he's also a project director of Good Thinking Society and the president of Merseyside Skeptics Society. He has lectured on the role of bad PR in journalism for the University of Sunderland, Sheffield Hallam, Bournemouth and the University of São Paulo in Brazil. He regularly speaks with proponents of pseudoscience for the Be Reasonable podcast, and his work has seen him organise international homeopathy protests, going undercover to expose psychics and quack medics, and co-founding the popular QED conference. He has also written for The Guardian, The Times, New Scientist and New Statesman, and is the editor of the UK Skeptic magazine. So please fill the chat bar with applause and welcome to the screen, Michael Marshall.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kat. And it's very nice to be here speaking for everyone at a somewhat short notice. But hopefully you'll enjoy this replacement, even though I'm not going to be talking about QAnon. I will talk about the ways in which there are falsehoods that pervade us in our everyday lives. I recognise that it has got closed captioning for those who need it. I would love to see how that deals with my accent, because whenever an automatic closed captioning deals with a slightly Geordie accent such as mine, it does some very interesting things around some of the vowels, but we'll see how you get on. Hopefully it's not going to be too bad for you. So Kat's done the introduction for me and covered pretty much everything that I would have mentioned across the various different things that I do, and I've been a full-time skeptical investigator for since 2014 with the Good Thinking Society, and I've been with the Merseyside Skeptics Society since 2009. And the talk I'm going to give tonight really does go back to one of the first things I got really interested in when I first got involved in skepticism, which is about how stories make it into the newspapers, what journeys stories go on, and what decisions get made along the way in order to get what ends up in your hand, or more usually on your screen at the end of the day, and exactly what forces are at work in influencing what counts as news and how news gets told. And this is something I've been looking at on and off for, I guess, about 12 years, something like that now. And I want to start here. With Jeremy Clarkson's penis, because Jeremy Clarkson has the largest penis in show business. Now, those aren't my words. Those aren't the words of Jeremy Clarkson, I don't believe. But they are actually the headline and the story, the thrust of this particular story from The Sun newspaper and several other newspapers back in 2010 when I first started getting interested in how things make it into the news. And this was actually the story that caught my eye, that I really sat down and thought, well, hang on, how is this a news story? How has this been past the editorial decision-making of several different newspapers, national newspapers, and made it into the paper? How's this come to print? Because I thought this story could only come from one of several different means, one of several different ways of getting to this headline. So maybe this was a scientific discovery. Maybe there were anatomical experts who'd looked at Jeremy Clarkson and evaluated his height and his wingspan. And from there, they'd algorithmically figured out, they've algorithmically extrapolated the information to figure out exactly how long his penis must be. And that's the kind of scientific discovery that was driving an important story like this. But that isn't the genesis of this story. But perhaps this was an experimental piece of research. Maybe one day an unlucky work experience kid came into the lab to find half the population of British television lined up along one wall with their trousers at their ankles and a tape measure in their hand. And they had to do the due diligence to find out who had the largest penis in show business. That wasn't the story behind this story. That is not how this story came to be. How this story made it into Sun newspaper and several other national newspapers on that particular day was a company asked a panel of women to guess. Here is a list of some male celebrities' names, and from here, stick some numbers next to them. It's pure speculation. Just come up with whatever you think feels right, and that's how it made it into a national newspaper. And that I think is very interesting and surprising. That is as flimsy as this story was. And as a side note, there's probably a right answer to the question, because Jeremy Clarkson appears to be a man. We can reasonably infer he may well have a penis. So we could track down Jeremy Clarkson and wrestle him to the ground. And if we could prevent ourselves from scratching our eyes out for long enough, we could very easily find out if his penis is long or short. But until we do that single act of observation, there is no way of knowing whether Jeremy Clarkson has a large or small penis. It's essentially Schrodinger's cock. That's what we're dealing with here. But actually, the company, the real story, the story that put this in the newspaper, it was actually from a company called F-Buddy, who asked those panel of women to stick random numbers next to male celebrities' names. And if anybody in the audience is particularly innocent, that F stands for friendly. It was friendlybuddy.com was the people who commissioned that particular study, and they commissioned it through a company called OnePoll. And we will touch on OnePoll repeatedly throughout the course of the evening in terms of the market research that they do, because they're incredibly prolific in publishing this kind of material. But this story, which was just based on pure speculation, pure guesswork, nothing more than conjecture, made it into several national newspapers, and it was printed unquestioningly by the journalists. And I think that's an interesting thing. And it got me thinking about how stories end up in the newspapers. And then there's another set of stories that also got me ticking along in the same direction. It related to stories that used to appear quite regularly, like these. So this in the Sun, you can see from 2011, the £3 billion golden yacht is the world's most expensive yacht because it's a yacht with £3 billion worth of gold built into it. You had the solid gold and gem encrusted mobile phone. So a solid gold mobile phone that was in I think the Telegraph at the time. You had Nuts magazine, when Nuts magazine still existed, talking about the solid gold iPhone. And here in the Daily Mail, you can see when the iPad 2 was launched, they launched it with a £5 million iPad 2 that was made of gold and encrusted with dinosaur bones. And these stories reflected a spate of luxury goods stories that routinely appeared in the media, right across the broad spectrum of the media. So from Nuts magazine to Time magazine, from the Sun to the Guardian and the Times and the sort of the broadsheet types of stories. So it really was prolific. Every fortnight you'd see a story like these appearing, and it was all about kind of the high-end celebrity culture, how the other half live. And really what it was doing was then trying to sell a slightly lower rent version where they would gold plate your iPhone rather than making it out of solid gold. Now, the interesting thing about these stories is they all come from the same source. The same one person was behind every one of these stories that appeared all around the world on a fortnightly basis across the full broad spectrum of the media. And that guy was a goldsmith called Stuart Hughes, who was based in Liverpool, where I live. And he was actually, I was working for a marketing company at the time. He was actually a former client of mine. And so I actually knew some of the stuff that he was doing and some of the stuff that he was asking other design agencies to do. And what's interesting about all of these stories that really did play out across the broad spectrum of the media is there is no evidence any of these products were actually real. There's no evidence any of the things that were the subject of the stories were actual real products that existed in real life. So, for example, some of the images were simply photoshopped. Stuart would just take a photo of a yacht, for example, and then give it to a digital marketing agency to Photoshop. Not my agency, I hasten to point out. But here you can see there's the golden yacht that was meant to be worth £3 billion and made of solid gold. And below it, you can see a yacht that I found on the website of a yacht manufacturer. And you can see very clearly it is the same picture. It's just one of them has been photoshopped gold. And I actually tracked down the photographer that was named in all of the news stories as being the one who'd taken the photo of the £3 billion yacht. He had the credit, the image credit on the photograph. And I actually tracked him down and asked him, did you see a £3 billion yacht? And he confirmed he absolutely did not, and that no such yacht exists. Which makes sense, because if a yacht was carrying £3 billion worth of gold, I would question its ability to stay afloat if it was just a yacht of that size. Other images were stolen from websites. So they take a photograph, an image from a website that was claiming to gold plate or gold color your iPad, and then they put that on their website saying they'd made the iPad out of gold. They'd replaced key components with gold to make it sure it was a full, robust gold solid implement. And it never existed. And then other products were simply spray painted gold, like this BMX, which is one of the first stories that made it in the Liverpool Echo, which is just a spray painted gold BMX. It's not actually a solid gold BMX. But these stories would appear across the news media over a series of years, always with the same kind of story behind it, always come from Stuart Hughes, and none of the journalists would stop to even ask, as far as I could tell, what were incredibly basic questions that would help you realize these aren't real products. So the journalist wouldn't say, can I actually see one of these products? Can I see it and hold it in my hand? They wouldn't do the due diligence. And it made me think, well, why is that? Why wouldn't a journalist spend the time, the very small amount of time it would take, to spike these stories and so that they would not run? And I think to answer that question, we have to kind of understand what we mean and what we think of as journalism, what we mean when we think of a journalist. Because it may well have been, I grew up with an impression in my head, you may well have shared it, of a journalist as the Lois Lane type, the tenacious seeker of truth. You know, they're out there on the streets with a network of sources trying to speak truth to power and bring justice to those who deserve it, and to bring down those who are doing evil deeds in the darkness, to bring that to light. And maybe that is what a journalist used to be. You know, the classic image of a journalist with a fedora or a trilby on, with a press card tucked in, licking a pencil and taking notes in a notepad. Maybe that's what a journalist used to be decades ago, but a lot changed in the intervening decades, and journalism has changed significantly as an industry and become something quite different. And where that changed, a big part of that change is around the ownership of newspapers. So time was that newspapers would routinely be owned by business magnates, people who'd already made their money elsewhere, you know, captains of industry, important newspaper men. And it almost always, I think it actually exclusively was men at the time. And these were people who'd made their millions, made their fortunes in other industries, and then they wanted to own a newspaper because they wanted to be seen as the serious kind of person who owns a newspaper. That's the role they have in society. That's how important they are. They own newspapers for the kudos rather than the cash. You know, they wanted the prestige rather than the profits. But then around about 30 years ago, a little bit longer than that, businessmen started to come in and buy up newspapers. People like Rupert Murdoch, Richard Desmond, Robert Maxwell, those types of people. And when you're a businessman who wants to run a newspaper as a profit-making business rather than as a tool of political influence, if you, well, not necessarily rather, as well as a tool of political influence, because there's no doubting that Rupert Murdoch has wielded his newspaper empire for quite a lot of political influence. But if you also want to try and make money out of it, you do what any business-minded person would do, and you look to see where can you cut corners, where can you cut some of your expenditure without necessarily damaging the product too much, where can you try to trim the fat, as it were. And that's what happened to the newspaper industry. The people came in to try and see where what they decided to be fat could be trimmed. And so what would happen was they'd take a look at their existing staffing levels and decide who didn't need to be there. So why would you, for example, have somebody sat in a courtroom all day listening to the court cases, someone who's an expert, who spent a lot of time developing a level of expertise and an ear for what makes a good, interesting story from a courtroom? Why have that person sit there all day when you can fire them and have your general desk journalist call the courtroom at the end of the day and ask for notes on the interesting cases? You still get to report on what happened in court. You don't need somebody sat in the courtroom the entire day to produce it. But what you miss is that level of expertise, that level of objectivity. what you end up with once you fired that person is you only print the stuff the court thinks is interesting. And that might be based on what the court want you to print in terms of what stories they want to get out there. Or it also might be slightly less malevolent than that. It might just be that they don't recognize what would make an interesting story to the public. And so interesting stories get lost along the way because you've lost that objectivity of an external expert who spends all their time really evaluating what's happening in court. But the number of stories in the newspaper is the same. So if you're a business person and you're just trying to fill a newspaper so you can put ads in it and sell it to people, it doesn't make a huge difference to you. We saw the same with science journalism. There was a big contraction of expert science journalists as people left the industry as they lost their roles and there weren't as many spaces for them. And the roles instead would be filled with inexpert in terms of science, general journalists. You still get to put science stories in the newspaper, but this time those science stories are saying that bacon causes cancer or bacon cures cancer. It has slightly ameliorated in the last sort of decade or so, thankfully. But as well as getting rid of your specialist reporters, the other thing you do is start to reduce the number of reporters that you have. Because why have 5 people writing 3 stories a day when you can trim that down and make 3 people write 6 stories a day or something in that kind of region? You know, you can still produce the same amount or even more content with fewer bodies in the office. And that's what happened. There were fewer and fewer opportunities in journalism, and the journalists that were left had to write more and more stories every day. And because you don't get to have more hours in the day, when you have to write more copy per day, what you lose is the time it takes to really figure a story out. So your ability to source your own stories, to corroborate facts with external experts and subject matter experts and things like that, external witnesses, and to really delve and fact check stories in a very deep way. And the other thing you lose is that because you're losing that ability to have the time to generate your own stories, you become much more reliant on people who want to give you pre-written copy. So you become much more reliant on things like PR and much more reliant on news agency copy, like Newswire services. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Here's an illustration of how that works, for example. So back in 2010, when I was vice president of the Merseyside Skeptics Society, we did a PR stunt to demonstrate there was nothing in homeopathy called the 1023 campaign, where we had people go into their local pharmacy, buy some homeopathic pills, and then everybody all together would stand outside the pharmacy and take an overdose of those pills to prove that nobody falls ill, nobody has any ill effects, because homeopathy is nothing but sugar pills. At the time, here it is reported in the Independent. You can see there's a quote from me saying something I'm sure enormously insightful. Here's the same story in the Daily Mail, and here's the same story in the BBC, each of them carrying exactly the same quote. Now, the thing is, I didn't speak to the BBC, and I didn't speak to the Independent, and I didn't speak to the Daily Mail. At no point did I speak to any reporter from any of those newspapers. On the day of that overdose, I gave one interview to the Press Association, a Newswire, a news agency. And that is the story that ran everywhere. The BBC ran the story of the homeopathic overdose as their front story, their main story on the homepage of their website for the entire day. At no point did anybody from the BBC phone me to check if the overdose actually happened. No journalist, in fact, called me to see whether the thing they reported on actually happened. What's interesting about the BBC is we actually spent about a fortnight in the run-up to the overdose trying to get the BBC interested. I talked to the science department, I talked to the local radio, the local TV, the local news, the nationals, and every bit of it I was saying, look, this is going to be a big story, you're going to want to cover it. But every time I was told, well, maybe, I'm not sure whether we'll have anyone, I'm not sure how it'll work out, and nobody covered it. But I gave one 5-minute interview to the Press Association, and it ran as the top story on the BBC for the entirety of the day. And nobody phoned to check that it was definitely true, that it definitely happened. In fact, those stories in the Independent and the Mail are word for word identical. This is just verbatim copy taken from the Press Association copy. So what is the Press Association? What is a Newswire, given that it has this kind of role? Well, the idea of a news agency is that rather than every newspaper having correspondents in all different areas of the world and all different occupations to understand what's going on, which is obviously very expensive for every newspaper to be doing that, instead a news agency would set up to have reporters everywhere, and then newspapers pay a subscription to get access to what the news agency finds. So the news agency, the Press Association, will have somebody in Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe, for example, was still president, and they would report on what's happening in Zimbabwe. And then newspapers would pay a subscription fee, pick out the stories they think are interesting, and write those up for the day. And that makes it a very efficient way of disseminating information, but not necessarily a very efficient way of telling information from misinformation or disinformation. It's not a good way of evaluating accuracy and truth in there. It's not a good way of evaluating what's actually happening. And one of the reasons for that is the scope, the remit and purpose of a newswire is slightly different to a newspaper. It's a subtle difference, but a newswire's aim is for accuracy, whereas a newspaper should be aiming for truth. And that might seem like a really technical distinction, the difference between accuracy and truth. But in the real world, it can play out in really important ways. So let's say, for example, Robert Mugabe, when he was still the president of Zimbabwe, let's say he gave a speech in Zimbabwe saying, "I'm the greatest and most important president any African nation has ever had, and I've done nothing but good for my people, and they are blessed to have me." If you're going to report on that speech accurately, you're going to say where the speech took place, how many people were there, exactly what Mugabe said, what the setting of it was. If you're going to report on it truthfully, you add in why he's lying. You add in the context of the history of his leadership of Zimbabwe that proves that what he's saying isn't true. We can do the same thing with Donald Trump. Report accurately on what Donald Trump is saying, and if you're just reporting accurately on what he says, you're going to go a long way away from the truth. But that is fine, because the job of the newswire is just to report what happened. It's the job of the journalists to then put that into context. So as long as newspapers take that initial starting point of the newswire and then do their journalism to it, then find external quotes and external opinions and external sources to corroborate it and add context and add historical context, then everything's working fine. But as we saw in the case of the illustration with the homeopathic overdose, routinely newspapers and news services would just print newswire copy verbatim. And I think that's a problem when you aren't doing that context adding, you aren't doing that fact checking. And here's how this can turn into a real problem. So in March 2015, this was a story in the Mirror about this particular lady who was suffering from breast cancer. And she was, instead of taking chemotherapy, instead of having conventional medicine, she was treating her cancer with a diet of raw vegetables and juices and supplements. And all the way through the article, as you read it, it talks about how she's standing up to doctors and taking control of her health to be brave and defiant. And she's going to cure her cancer her way. And I wrote an article about this for The Guardian, pointing out that this is a really irresponsible story to print in the form that it's printed, because obviously this lady has every right in the world to do what she wants to her body. And if she really wants to use alternative medicine when she's facing a cancer diagnosis, that's entirely her prerogative. But is the responsibility of the journalist to ensure that there's enough context in the story so that the reader who reads it doesn't think that actually this is going to work, doesn't leave with the impression that what she's doing is going to be effective. And that's what the story did. It was only really talking about how great a decision it was that she was doing this, and talking about it as if this was an active empowerment rather than a tremendous risk, because it didn't speak to an oncologist about what the real chances of this ineffective regime curing cancer would be. So when I wrote about this for The Guardian, I sent an email to the health editor of The Mirror asking for comment, as a responsible journalist would, to say, I'm going to be writing this story. Here's what I have to say about it. Would you like a right of reply? And I expected them to say something like, well, we're only telling her story. We don't necessarily endorse it. We're not telling people to follow suit. I think actually readers who had cancer may well get the impression that this was a good thing to do and may well have followed suit, but nevertheless. And that's what I was expecting them to say, though. I was expecting them to stand by the story and say that they had a right to publish what she was saying and made sure that it was only presenting it as her views. They didn't do that, though. What they did actually shocked me, because the health editor of The Mirror, or rather health desk of The Mirror, sent me back an email which simply said, the story you refer to came from Cater's news agency and the byline journalist works for them. So what they were saying is this story here in The Mirror by Charlotte Nisbet is not a story in The Mirror, because Charlotte Nisbet doesn't write for The Mirror. She writes for a news agency, so it's their fault, not ours. Now, I would argue anybody who opened the Mirror website on that day who saw that story would think that is a story in the Mirror, because it's in the Mirror. The masthead at the top of the newspaper adds weight. You can't just say, well, we took this from someone else and printed it, and the person who wrote it and we bylined them doesn't even work for us, and therefore it's not our responsibility. It absolutely is the responsibility of the newspaper to be responsible for what they're printing, to be accountable for what they're printing. And I don't think saying it came from a news agency and therefore it's not our problem is anywhere near good enough. And this isn't the only time it's happened. In fact, in 2019, here's another story in the Mirror, this time by someone called Hattie Bishop. The Sun also published it. It was talking about how this woman is, she's keeping her cancer at bay. You know, regular mistletoe injections keep her cancer at bay. Well, who is Hattie Bishop? Here's Hattie Bishop on Twitter pointing out this is a lovely, positive, festive health story about a cancer patient being convinced that using mistletoe therapy will cure her cancer. That is not a festive story. That is a dangerous and irresponsible way of sharing information about alternative medicine. And Hattie Bishop is the deputy features editor of a news service. So she isn't a journalist. She's from a news agency. And in fact, she's from a news agency, Southwest News Services, which is the same group that owns OnePoll, that marketing company I mentioned earlier, who I will come back to, as well as 72 Point, a PR company that works with them. Now, in the case of that lady in the Mirror, unfortunately, I spent some time tracking that story, and I was able to see when the inevitable happened. And unfortunately, she did die from the cancer that she was failing to treat with alternative medicine. It's an incredibly tragic story. But there was no story in the Mirror from any news agency saying that person we told you was curing their cancer died from their cancer. So any readers who saw that story and were persuaded to follow suit will never see the story about what happens as a result, because it's not novel when somebody who has cancer dies of cancer, and therefore it doesn't make it into the newspapers. And I think this is where there's a real responsibility, therefore, in journalism to add the important context that a story from a news agency might be missing because they're just reporting accurately on what has been said and where. So there was a study from Cardiff University, the fantastic journalism department of Cardiff University, which spent a fortnight looking at the top 5 newspapers in the UK to see if you could track where every story came from. What was the original source of that story? This was conducted in 2008. It was actually in relation to the book Flat Earth News by Nick Davies, which is a fantastic read about all these kind of issues, really. And that study showed that 30% of all of the stories in the top 5 newspapers in this country replicated news agency copy verbatim. So not a single word was changed. And then a further 19% were largely dependent on agency copy, where you might take the bulk of the agency copy and throw a quote at the bottom. So 49% of news stories in the best quality journalism in the country were derived from news agency copy in this way and were largely or wholly unchanged. And this is just newspapers, but of course then the broadcast news, so the television, the radio, they pick up on the agenda that's in the newspapers and also from the Newswire. And then you have the secondary and tertiary news, so things like your radio talk shows, Loose Women, The Right Stuff, and magazines that pick up on these things. They will pick up on what was in the news as well. So it has a further impact into the news from this place. So when you don't do that context checking, that fact checking on news agency copy, it disseminates pretty broadly. And part of the reason for this, as I say, is that it's a financial constraint to the model of the news as it stands. So this is these are graphs of the top newspapers in the UK by circulation figures. And as you can see, very few people are buying newspapers. Pretty much all of those newspapers take quite a precipitous drop over the last 40 years. And if we amalgamate all of that, you can see it goes down really significantly. So there are fewer and fewer people buying newspapers anymore, which means there's less and less money in newspapers. And then there's other sources of income that were lost from the news that maybe you don't think about. So it used to be that if you wanted a job, you'd go to the job classified section in a newspaper, and newspapers would make money out of this. These days, you go to online job sites or LinkedIn, and so that money goes away. The classified section is where you would sell your secondhand, a secondhand car or a bit of furniture. Now you do that on eBay or Gumtree, and so that money doesn't go into a newspaper. So lots of sources of income for the newspaper have gone away and have never been replaced. And that source of income is what was being used to then pay for the journalism that tells truths about the world and really does do that kind of investigative digging. And maybe you could think, well, advertising is going to cover the costs. So obviously websites have now filled with adverts, but adverts will not cover the cost because nobody uses them. The vast majority of there's a click-through rate on an advert is less than 0.1%. I think the vast majority of those clicks are probably people doing it by accident to immediately then close the tab. I don't click on adverts deliberately. And loads of people have ad blockers as well. So you don't even see the adverts to then serve and get money from. And you can see from the graph, print revenue is not going to save the day either, because print revenue has taken a colossal dip between the mid-2000s and now. So the money has really gone out of the model. And so this is why newspapers turn to things like native advertising, where you get stories like this, which look like an actual story. They have all the layout of an actual legitimate news story, but then at the bottom you can see it says in association with HSBC. So this story all about how people her age can own a home even if they don't expect it is nothing but an advert for HSBC. But it's more effective than an advert because it looks like it's journalism. So it carries the veneer and the trust of journalism, but actually it's just there to deliver a commercial message, which is if you need help getting a home, you should go to HSBC. They know what they're talking about. That's the message of this particular piece. And native advertising is absolutely everywhere across the modern media landscape. If you go to the Daily Mail, for example, you'll often see these sections down the sidebar of shame where it will say sponsored. This means that story was paid for to be there, even though it looks, as you can see from the right-hand side, it looks an awful lot like all of the other Daily Mail stories. And the readers may not be able to see the difference between what is a story that was contributed to by a journalist and what was given to a newspaper for money. What the newspaper sold that space and haven't got control over what's in that space. So there's a real issue, I think, here, because what it does is it starts to erode the trust that you can have that what you're reading in the newspaper is actually from the newspaper and not from a commercial source. And then you get stuff like this. This is The Guardian from quite a while back now, in fact. But you can see the stories there, related stories from The Guardian, and then promoted links from around the web provided by Outbrain, who are a content aggregator who pay money to newspaper websites to hire out a space on their pages that they control the content to and not The Guardian. So in this particular case, Outbrain has put 4 links there that The Guardian don't see and don't have any control over, really. And what are those links? Well, 2 of them are for financial schemes from the Telegraph and TSB. One of them is a scam IBS cure product, which is a completely bullshit product promoted in The Guardian as if it's a real Guardian story. And the other one was a PPI scam. These are ways that those companies are trying to use the legitimacy of The Guardian to sell their scam services, knowing full well that a small percentage of people will be persuaded because they will think this is a Guardian thing rather than a random link that The Guardian had no control over. But because The Guardian needs money, because newspapers need money, they rent out space on their website and rent out some of their name and credibility to it. And I think that's a real issue. Part of the real issue is that it erodes that trust. You don't know what was actually in the newspaper because a journalist and an editor thought it was an important story, and or whether what was there because somebody paid for that to appear. And once you don't have that level of trust in what ends up in the newspaper, you are always questioning. I think it makes it very hard to have any level of certainty or surety that what's in the newspaper is there because it is actually news. And so this all contributes to the world that we're in now. So journalists today, from this 2008 study from Cardiff University, journalists today are writing 3 times as much copy per day as their counterparts were 30 years ago. And so that means that they no longer have the time to check facts, source their own stories and delve deeper. And I think this is what leads to poor journalism. You know, for all the control that people like Murdoch and the like have over their newspapers, I actually think it's their business sense that it contributes to the lowering standards of journalism even more. Because this is why you end up with things like the dark arts, things like phone hacking, bin raking, paying the police for information, that kind of stuff. These are all illegal and immoral shortcuts to get to a story when you don't have the resourcing or the time or the inclination necessarily to get to the story the right way. These are ways of getting a juicy story without having the resources that it would take to do it legitimately. And then the flip side of that is it leads to stuff like journalism, which is printing as your own work stuff that was given to you and written by someone else, just taking what comes into your inbox and putting your name on it and popping it in the newspaper. And this is what we see a huge amount of. And to give you an idea of why this is so prevalent, I'm not someone who says this is because journalists are lazy. I don't think that's the case. I think in a lot of cases, they're under a huge amount of pressure, because if they're having to write 3 times as much copy per day, Imagine you're a journalist who's approaching your deadline and you've got to write 6, 7 stories for that day, and you've only written 5 stories. You know that if you get to deadline without filing all the copy you need to, you'll get it in the neck from your editor. It'll be harmful in the long run to your career. It won't go well for you personally. Whereas if you get to that point, having written 5 stories, and you go into your email inbox and take the first 2 stories that look legitimate from that people have sent you, nothing bad will ever happen to you or your career. Things will be absolutely fine. In fact, I could see why a journalist who might be writing, let's say they're writing 6 stories a day, might think, well, I'm going to do 2 stories fantastically. I'm going to do 2 really good, really well-sourced, really accurate, really nuanced and filled with context stories that I can be really proud of. And to do that, I'll need to publish 4 random stories from my inbox. But at the end of the day, I'm going to go home thinking about these two pieces of fantastic journalism that I can be proud of, not really thinking about the fact that 2/3 of my output that day was bullshit I didn't check. So I think this is an issue. And to illustrate the issue, there was a piece in the Evening Standard, just a little sidebar, which pointed out how much pressure there is from people trying to give stories to the newspaper for them to print. And so it said here, the number of calls to this office yesterday from PR people who don't read the paper and don't know anything, but called just before deadline, 7,298 phone calls. So if you're quite a junior journalist and you've got that one extra story to file and you can't find anything that you think looks legit, and you know there's more than 7,000 phone calls from people trying to give you a story, I can entirely see why you would succumb to some of that and say, okay, I'll take the best of those and nothing bad will ever happen. That pressure on you, I think, is understandable. It's why I think if the world of journalism is to change to try and resist some of the stuff I'm about to show you, I think it can't come from junior journalists. It has to come from higher up in the industry, and hopefully there's signs that that's starting to change in some places. So when it comes to those PR companies trying to push stories in the newspaper, I always like to show a few examples. So, for example, this is from about 10 years ago, but I think they're really reflective of the type of stuff PR companies will do. You've got here from the Daily Express and the Sun, breathe in, it's Fat Day, and today is Fat Monday. So as the Sun says, today is the day that British women feel at their fattest. It's claimed 3 in 4 females are depressed about their weight in January. And on the 3rd Monday of the month, inquiries for fat-removing liposuction soar by 70%. So you have the story that on this day in January, women feel fattest and decide to take drastic action. From the same client, from a PR company, later in the same year, you have this one: why we can't look in the mirror once we've hit 45. We are unable to face the fact we're getting older. So it paints a picture of how we stare in the mirror, and we can't bear to look at ourselves because of the aged death mask that stares back that we barely even recognize. And by we can see from the picture, we really mean women. It really is saying that women can't bear to look at themselves at the age of 45. All of these stories came from the same client, which you will be entirely unsurprised to learn is the Transform Cosmetic Surgery Group. These are just stories placed by a company called Brazen PR in order to make women feel insecure about their looks, so that they might think, well, if everybody else is turning to plastic surgery on January the 17th, maybe I should inquire, because if everyone's doing it, then it's entirely fine that I do that as well. That it might well be true that lots of people are doing it, but this is contributing to the pressure on women to do something similar to that, and it's contributing in a way that isn't legitimate sociological research about how societies function. It's just an advert for a cosmetic surgery group. But if you turned the page of a newspaper and saw an advert that said, women, you are fat and horribly old, come and get plastic surgery, you would tut and roll your eyes and think it was awful. But because it's framed as sort of psychological research about how women are and how society is, it gets a pass and people remember it and think about it afterwards. And I think it has more of an impact in that way. It's also far, far cheaper to pay a PR company to write up a story like that gets published in several national newspapers than it is to take out an advert in those several national newspapers. So not only is it cheaper to do, it's also, I think, more effective because it's less overt. And it's not just women who are the targets of cosmetic surgery. You may have seen stories in March this year about how Prince William was voted the world's sexiest bald man, and how all the papers were saying, isn't that ridiculous? The Rock is bald, Dave Bautista's bald, there's Stanley Tucci's bald. Look at all these hot bald men who are hotter than Prince William. All of these stories were coming off the back of the PR that was put out by a cosmetic surgery group trying to encourage bald men to go to Turkey to get their hair transplanted. So this is a company that went to a PR company and said, how do we get attention? And that PR company decided the best way to get attention would be to come up with the sexiest bald man in the world and make it someone that isn't obvious, so that everybody would not only print the story, but then would print rebuttals pointing out how isn't it ridiculous? Here are these much hotter bald men, so you get so much more play out of it. And in every one of those stories, the client names gets mentioned, and in every one of those stories, we reinforce the idea that men who are balding should really look into getting hair transplanted. And hey, do you know you can get it done in Turkey? That is all that's at play here. This is just an advert masquerading as news. And because there's pressure on the newspapers to publish as much stuff as possible, anything that looks like a news story that you know is going to get attention and a bit of clicks gets into the newspaper pretty much. And really what's happening here is the cheapening of journalism to a degree. Here's another example. It's usually women who are the subject of incredibly sexist stories. Occasionally it's men. Here's an example of the latter of those. So this is from, again, 2010, one of the early ones that I found, but I like to use. Think he knows you, think again. How millions of men don't know their partner's dress size, date of birth, or even eye colour. And it paints a picture of millions of British males are astonishingly ignorant about their partner's basic characteristics. And it's saying that their failure to pay attention can even lead to a relationship to break down. So men, because you know nothing at all about the person sat across the breakfast table to you, that relationship is going to fail. You need to start memorizing basic characteristics of the borderline stranger you're staring at every day. Otherwise, she will leave you. And what are those basic characteristics we need to remember? Well, we've got a clue there. And in case it wasn't obvious as to what the reason for this is, this was a survey of men buying scent for their female partner at the perfume shop. So this is an advert for the perfume shop. It's PR put out by the perfume shop, which has some subtle hints in it that it was a perfume shop. You know, obviously the most important thing you have to remember about the person you're in a relationship with is what their favorite perfume is. Now, you might ask, why would the perfume shop have a motive to tell men that if they don't know their partner's favorite perfume, it will lead to the death of their relationship? And in fact, we can go further and say, why would the perfume shop put that particular message into the newspapers on February the 9th, 5 days before Valentine's Day? This is just an advert. It's saying, hey, men, Valentine's Day is coming up. You should buy your partner's favorite perfume. But because this isn't framed as an advert, it's framed as sociological research, it gets way more play in the newspapers, and it's got more stickiness in your mind than an advert for the perfume shop would ever have in the newspapers. You would just overlook an advert, but this sticks, I'd argue. So PR is absolutely everywhere in the media. In fact, it's also in the Newswire, which is obviously a problem because we know that journalists will often use Newswire content verbatim as a shortcut to getting stuff printed in the newspaper. So 75% of news agency reporters admitted they use PR often. So add those figures in from the 2008 Cardiff study. 60% of the main quality newspapers are wholly or largely PR on Newswire, and a further 20% contain strong elements of PR on Newswire, which means 80% of the stories in this one study from 2008 were traceable back to PR or Newswire that were compromised or potentially compromised sources. 4/5 of what we consider the best journalism, and then it goes on to be elsewhere, picked up by the radio and TV and things like that. So that's the size of the problem. How do we spot PR? Well, it's difficult because the best PR is designed to try to cover its tracks, but there are some signs. There's a rule that I think I came up with. I'm not sure if somebody else came up for it. I'm trying to find where I found it, but I'm sure I found it somewhere, but I may have come up with it. I don't know. But essentially, if the name of a company appears out of place in the third or fourth paragraph of a news story, that's the company that paid for the PR. So if it isn't a story about a car company and then a car company gets a mention around paragraph 4, that's the car company is the one that paid for the story to be there. The reason that works is, if you think back to the old days where copy and paste really was a pair of scissors and a paste brush, if you wanted to suddenly reduce the amount of words in a story because a bigger, more important story came along, you'd have to be able to cut down paragraphs out of the story. And so journalists write articles with the most important facts in the top couple of paragraphs and the next most important ones from there, and so on down, which means the editor knows that if I need to get rid of half of this story, I can just cut half the bottom of it off and it should stand on its own. So if your aim as a PR company is to get your client name mentioned in the newspaper, you need your client name high enough up to escape the cut, but not so high that it's in the first line when it's really obvious that this cosmetic surgery group wants to tell women they're fat. And the fourth paragraph is round about the right place for it. There's no hard and fast rule, but it's broadly speaking the fourth paragraph. So keep a lookout for when you see a business name mentioned around the fourth paragraph. That's one of the top tips. I'm going to talk to you about different types of PR as we kind of go through. Occasionally, businesses get so good at understanding where the buttons are in the media that they're able to quite effectively hoax the media with PR bullshit. And so here's one of my favorite examples. So this was a story from 2014 which said a company was making some commemorative mugs ahead of the international tournament in 2014, the World Cup, with England players on them. And somebody wasn't paying attention. They Googled for a picture of Chris Smalling, the Man United defender. And what they found was a picture of Barack Obama. And without even realizing, they didn't recognize him. They just put him on the mug as Chris Smalling, and then thousands went off to print, and then they were bought up by a company that sells remaindered stock. I think this story, even though it made international headlines as a quirky one of those stories, I think this story is patently bullshit and could not possibly be true if you pause for even a second and think about it. So, for example, for this to be true, it would have to be the case that if you Googled Chris Smalling, you'd get a picture of Barack Obama. Now, you can do that. You can go to Google Images, which is where they said they found the photo. You can put in date filters to before this story was ever published, and you can put the words Chris Smalling in, and at no point do you get a picture of Barack Obama. So on that basic level, it can't possibly be true. But also, if this story actually held up, and this really was how these mugs came to be, you'd need to have been able to find a picture of Barack Obama wearing a 2014 England top, which obviously didn't happen. Obviously, there was no photo of Barack Obama wearing a contemporary England shirt during the 2014 World Cup. So the photo can't possibly have existed. It had to be photoshopped, which means it had to have been faked. And I'd argue this is just a PR for the company that then bought the thousands of mugs, who then their whole business model is selling remaindered stock and novelty items. And this clearly fits in with their business models and sends the message to the world that, hey, if you've got some remaindered stock you want shifted, come to us. We're experts at it. And this played in all the newspapers. None of the journalists involved paused for a second to ask even the very, very basic question, could this be true? Does the story hold up? Does it pass the sniff test? Because it was too good a story to turn down, knowing full well that people are going to give it clicks. Because if you're a journalist who's writing 7 stories a day, why would you spend 15 or 20 minutes effort in order to spike a story? Because at the end of the day, you've got 20 fewer minutes to do the work that you need to do, and you're back to square one. So I think that's why these stories were so successful. Similar to this is before the birth of William and Kate's first child, George. So the story goes that while Kate was pregnant, a Dorset-based commemorative plate manufacturer got a tip-off that she was going to give birth to a baby girl. And so they printed thousands of the royal baby princess commemorative plates. And then Prince George came along, and it turns out that he was a boy all along, and these plates are worthless. And so thousands of remaindered stock available that are now being bought up by a remaindered stock wholesaler and sold in that way. Again, there's no way this story could be true. There's absolutely no way the story could be true. I mean, first of all, we'd question whether a commemorative plate manufacturer in Devon where would they get an insider tip as to what's going on inside of Kate Middleton's womb? Like, how insider is their insider tip? But beyond that, is the world of commemorative plate manufacturing so fiercely competitive that you can't even wait for a baby to be born before you print up a plate commemorating the birth? I don't think it's that competitive. But even if it was that competitive, your target audience are people who are going to buy a commemorative plate of the royal baby. Why would they buy a commemorative plate featuring a picture of a baby that isn't the royal baby? That kid on that plate is not the royal baby. So who would possibly buy this plate? The story doesn't stand up if you think about it for a second. But if you spend any time thinking about it as a journalist, it's time you're not writing the story up and moving on to your next one. So maybe you just accept it and maybe you print it, knowing full well that it's going to get a lot of clicks, which means a lot of hits to the site, which means a lot of clicks in advertising revenue, or small amounts of clicks, at least in advertising revenue. And if you're thinking this all sounds a bit familiar, you may have seen the hashtag Free Brittany t-shirts that were made in error, whereas someone sent to a printer artwork for a Free Britney, as in Free Britney Spears, to be put on a t-shirt in order to be supportive of Britney Spears in her fight against conservatorship, but accidentally spelt it Brittany, as in the region of France. And now there's 10,000 misspelled t-shirts, manufactured by the company who bought the remaindered stock of those royal princess plates, and of the Barack Obama mugs, and of the Star Wars toys that had weird, funny names, and of several other stories of this ilk, just prolifically getting printed in the newspapers, not just in the UK, but around the world as well. even though in all these cases, there's no evidence that there's 10,000 of these T-shirts. I don't even know that there was any of these T-shirts until this story made it into a newspaper, at which point it became commercially worthwhile printing a few to get some proper pictures taken. Because you know that journalists are looking for stories that have that quirky, interesting nature to them, you can play into that, and companies do that in order to get themselves mentioned in the newspapers as a form of advertising. And coming to companies using newspapers as a form of advertising in this kind of way, I want to talk about, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on one particular form of PR that I spend a long time tracking, and that's the bullshit surprising survey. Our survey says X, 30% of people think this, 1 in 3 people do that. You will all have seen the model of these stories, the way that these stories are presented. They're always very formulaic. They're incredibly prolific, and they always have a huge secondary impact, which means stories like this are the stories that get picked up as factlets to be used on loose women and mentioned on the right stuff, and the subject of a radio talk show phone-in, and 5 years later will appear as a little factlet box in a magazine. And the vast majority of these types of surveys are nothing but advertising. And I'm going to show you examples of that. So, for example, this is one of the ones I like to pick out from the Daily Mail quite a while back. Lipstick, cleavage, and a long hot bath. What women say makes them feel sexy. And it's saying scarlet red lipstick, matching nail varnish, having your cleavage on display. It might sound like a male fantasy, but these are the tricks that women use to make themselves feel sexy, new research says. And so it's pointing out these findings. It says here that women only feel sexy just once a week on a Saturday night. So women don't ever feel sexy any other times of the week, by and large, apart from a Saturday night. Any women watching this who feel sexy, you're wrong. You're not meant to. You're early. You need to hold back for a couple of days, because you're only allowed to feel sexy once a week on a Saturday night. And the list of things that you need to do in order to feel sexy were things like favorite perfume, painting your nails, coloring your hair, wearing heavy eye makeup, wearing red lipstick, fake tan, fake eyelashes. All coincidentally things you can buy from Superdrug, the company that placed this story in the newspaper. And in fact, making the subtext of the story text, which is the job of the spokesperson in these stories, we have the beauty director for Superdrug, a lady called Sarah Wolverston, who directs beauty for Superdrug. And she said in a quote in the article here, "This poll clearly indicates that while women know exactly what they have to do in order to feel sexy, they clearly aren't doing it often enough." So if you have to do all these things to feel sexy and you only feel sexy once a week, you're not doing it often enough, girls. So you need to start buying all of the products that we in Superdrug sell. I, as beauty director, will direct you to your beauty in order to make you fulfill your requisite amount of sexiness. I think this is quite damaging, sexist bullshit, but because this isn't printed as an advert, it's printed as a piece of sociological research about how women feel, I think it's got more stickiness. I think it's more likely to actually hit people in a way that they'd remember. And this is just an advert. But the contribution of this advert, I'd argue, is part of the drip feeding of sexism, the drip feeding of stereotyping and harmful stereotyping and gendered stereotyping that we see in the media that leads society to think about men and women generally in certain ways and in specific ways. And I think it contributes to that picture, and then it feeds from that picture to be able to print more of this stuff in a bit of a feedback loop. So that's one example. It's not always as serious as that. This is one that I always like. The sizzling sex secrets of our kitchen revealed. The average family kitchen is a setting of 384 arguments, 192 heart-to-hearts, 26,000 meals, and 7 sex romps. So you'll have sex in your kitchen 7 times, according to this article. This article is from a survey of 3,000 people commissioned by Siemens Home Appliances to mark the launch of a fridge freezer. A fridge freezer so amazing it will get you laid 7 times, apparently, according to this article. I actually think this is a really badly done piece of PR, because I would argue you shouldn't do a story around sex if your company name is Siemens. People might start questioning what is in that fridge freezer if that's what you're doing. But there we go. To show that this isn't all just stuff from the past, here's last Friday, a piece in the Mirror talking about how here's the map of Britain as to how we all like our burgers, in a piece commissioned by Baker Street Buns, who coincidentally in this piece found out that most of the criticisms we have of burgers is nothing to do with the burger, but is all about the bread, says a bread manufacturer. How convenient is that? Monday in the Mirror, Green King Inns, saying that you're more likely to have an intimate wedding these days. So not a massive do for a wedding, but a small intimate do. Coincidentally, Green King Inns have a current wedding service that allows you to use your local Green King pub as a wedding venue for cheap. And this is what they're trying to say. You know, swapping your lavish day for a smaller venue is something you can do. So get in touch with your local. That was Monday. Tuesday in the Mirror, we have the managing director of Your Valley Organics saying that people don't understand sustainability buzzwords but use them anyway. But really what he wants to say is you should switch to organics to try and help the planet, even though obviously organics are bad for the planet. But it's just an advert for his organic foods. Yesterday in the Mirror, we have here that British people are clueless about the warning lights on their dashboard from a company that's just getting you thinking about whether you've serviced your car or not. Have you got a warning light on your dashboard? If so, maybe you should come and get your car serviced at Virtu Motors PLC. It's the entire purpose of the story. And again, from the Mirror, just today, we have a story about how Britain wants all these different smart tech items, including a robotic lawnmower in their lives. We're all obsessed with smart tech, says TalkTalk, who are talking about how, you know, the outside spaces are extensions of the home, so you should be connected there too. So use TalkTalk to make sure your robotic lawnmower gets Wi-Fi. That's just the last week in the Mirror, and it's only the ones that I spent 5 minutes finding today. So these are still prolific, and in every time you can see that the headline talks about this is research about how humans work, but actually it's just an advert for a service and nothing more than that. I'm just going to skip over this slightly because I recognize I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to get to a further bit. So when you track this stuff for a long time, you start to spot patterns, and I want to tell you about one particular pattern that I spotted before I finish. These were stories that were all published around about the same time across different newspapers. So you've got here the Mail and the Sun saying that more than 40% of women under the age of 30 will have a one-night stand while on holiday. The Sun was saying Brit Hull girls go bonkers. You know, if you go abroad, women are likely to sleep with a stranger. That's the story behind these these articles. And then you have this other story in the Express saying that the weather in Britain was so miserable that summer, it was so much rain that it dampened everybody's libido and nobody wanted to have sex. So it's really clear what's happening here. Go abroad, you'll have sex with a lady you don't know. Stay at home, you're not having any sex. All of these articles came from the same company. It's called misstravel.com. Misstravel.com is a travel dating website whereby men who have lots of money and are lacking companionship can sign up and can be matched with women who want a free holiday if they're willing to be companions to men. So it's really clear what's happening in these stories. It's saying, men, if you've got enough money, go abroad, take a stranger abroad, she'll definitely sleep with you, because if you stay at home, you're not getting laid this summer. That is the subtext to all of these stories, and they all came from this one particular company. And this particular company, Mistravel, is just one of several companies owned by the same guy along the similar kind of business model. So you've got Mistravel, the travel dating website. You've got whatsyourprice.com, which is an auction dating website where rich men get to bid on the women they want to take out for a date, and whoever pays the most gets to keep her. It's just a cattle market, essentially. And then you have Seeking Arrangement, which is a sugar daddy dating website, which pairs men who have lots of money with women who are willing to exchange their companionship for money, which is one of the definitions of prostitution. And in fact, these businesses are all banned in certain states in America because of how closely they resemble prostitution businesses. They're all owned by the same guy, a guy called Brandon Wade. And when these articles were first published in 2012, I started to see his name cropping up more and more again in the newspapers across stories like those that I showed you, just things that are meant to feel like they're just about how everyday people live, but actually had this kind of undercurrent of a specific narrative. So I went back through all of 2012 to find every single time Brandon Wade's name came up in any of the national newspapers in the UK to see just how prolific was he in that year. And this is what I found. So all of these stories aren't necessarily about sex. They're not all necessarily about relationships or dating, but they are all from press releases started by Brandon Wade. Every one of these are essentially adverts for businesses that are banned in states of America for being prostitution businesses. That is 49 stories in 11 months, 30 of them in the Daily Mail. And this wasn't a one-off this particular year. I repeated the same experiment, the same investigation in 2016. I saw it had gone up. There were 87 Brandon Wade stories in 2016, including 31 in the Daily Mail, 24 in the Sun. But what was particularly interesting about 2012 was that was the year that the Daily Mail ran a very high-level anti-pornography campaign, where they started the fight back for decency starts here in a newspaper that's published 50 adverts for prostitutes, or 30 adverts for prostitutes over the course of the year. In none of those cases, I think, did the journalist realize that what they were doing was printing an advert for a prostitution business. I think they all looked at that and thought, this is just a fun bit of filler that I can put out as one of my stories for the day, and it doesn't matter to me what it does, what message it sends to the world, because it's not my job to think about it. I'm going to skip over this one as well. Many of those stories, all the polling kind of stories I talked about, all came from one particular company, and that is one poll. This company that I mentioned previously, from the Jeremy Clarkson story, from several other stories. One poll is a market research company that claims to have 100,000 users who sign up, and they're part of the market research. They'll take surveys that fill in this kind of data. But the problem is, as a user, you only get paid 10 pence for every survey that you complete, and you only get to take any money out of your account once you've made £40. So you spend a huge amount of time filling in loads and loads of surveys before you see any money at all. But also, for each survey, it's usually only 2,000 people, for example, who'll get paid. But it's not the 2,000 people to start the survey. It's the first 2,000 people to finish the survey, which I would argue is an incentive to work as quickly as you can through a survey without thinking about what you're answering. So I think there are incentives to take as many surveys as you can and to not think about your answers too much, because if you spend a long time really giving quality information in your answers to this particular market research survey, you're going to be beaten by the guy who clicks the first thing he sees and doesn't think once. So there's an incentive to go very, very quickly. And I think this actually biases the data so much that it's basically worthless, in my opinion. Similarly, there are screening questions to filter out ineligible users to make sure that you don't take surveys that you're not eligible for. But I think those screening questions are nowhere near adequate because they're easily evaded. It's really obvious what the right answer is. And if you think I'm just trying to take as many of these as possible before I make me 40 quid, it doesn't matter what my answers are, then you don't really care about taking surveys that you're not eligible for. So, for example, you see screening questions like this. Have you ever flown on an aeroplane? Now, is this survey really going to be about the time you weren't on an aeroplane? This survey is almost certainly going to be about your airplane experiences. So you're going to say yes to that regardless of whether you've been in an airplane or not, because you want your 10 pence. But once you do that, if you lie your way in, any data you give is meaningless, but it doesn't matter. It's just a bit of fun, right? It doesn't matter. It's not going to have any effect on the world. You know, have you given birth in the last 5 years? Is this really going to be about the time you didn't give birth? Of course not. This is going to be a survey about motherhood. You get leading questions in here as well. So question 16, so this is 16 questions in. Think how long you've been spending doing this survey. You get a question like, do you think your dog has the ability to heal you with their love and affection? Yes or no? If you say yes, the first answer, you click the first thing you see, then you're basically giving them a headline for a story. Did you know that 25% of Brits think their dogs can heal them with love and affection? You don't actually think that. You're just clicking the first thing you see because you want 10 pence. It's not mattering to you that you're contributing to a story that makes the news and then goes on from there and has an effect on the world. Or, for example, please be brutally honest. Whose cooking do you think is better? Your mum's or your wife's / partner's? You don't get to, and see, you've got a binary choice, your mum or your wife or partner. You don't get to say, actually, I do the cooking. You don't get to say they're about equal. You don't get to say it doesn't matter to me. You have to choose one or the other. And lo and behold, in all the newspapers, don't tell the wife men prefer their mother's cooking. And this was just an advert for Aunt Bessie's. I think it was Aunt Bessie's Yorkshire pudding, or maybe the Food Network UK. It was for a food service thing. Now, I would argue these articles would be no different if the results came out the other way. I would argue you could write these entire stories and just leave blanks for the nouns, and then just use the data to fill in the blanks in the nouns, because your purpose here isn't to tell a real story about what people think about their mum's cooking or their partner's cooking. It's to advertise the Food Network and use this as the hook. So I don't think the data is actually what's important here. You get this is another screening question that's inadequate. This survey is for children aged 5 to 15. Is a child at that age available to take this survey? Yes or no? If you say yes and your child isn't, you don't have a child or the child isn't there, immediately you're biasing the answers in this survey. But people are incentivized to take as many as possible as quickly as they can, so people will say yes to this. And then you end up with questions like this. Imagine a child aged 5 to 15, so a 6-year-old child. Would you like to spend more time playing outdoors? Yes or no? Well, what about a child who spends as much time as possible playing outdoors? They couldn't physically possibly spend more time outdoors. But if they say, no, I don't want to spend more time outdoors because I go outdoors from the moment I wake to the moment I sleep, they suddenly would be lumped in with kids who don't want to go out in order to push a message of kids these days don't want to go out. Questions like, do you think you enjoy summer more than your parents did when you were children? How is a 6-year-old going to answer that? On what basis is a 6-year-old making that decision? I think this is a meaningless question just designed to generate data that can be used to push a commercial narrative rather than actually say something true about the world. Or do you wish you spent more time outside? And the answer to this were, yes, but my parents won't let me. Yes, but we live in a built-up area. Yes, but I don't have enough time. Yes, but I have too much homework. Yes, but I'm afraid of playing outside. Or no. So 5 out of 6 answers were yes here. And lo and behold, when the story comes out, we have reasons why children refuse to go outside and play anymore. And this then goes on to have effects on the world. A story I often talk about is when the Educational Secretary, Michael Gove, tried to change the history curriculum of the UK because, to be back to being all about facts and figures, because survey after survey showed that children are historically ignorant about basic facts of British life. And by survey after survey, it turns out he was talking about stories he'd read in the Daily Mail that were actually just from surveys like this, pushing a commercial narrative. You know, kids know nothing about the Tudors, so maybe you should watch the UK TV Gold series about the Tudors. People who take part in the surveys and pretend their kids are with them at the time in order to make 10 pence have no idea that what they're doing is going to be giving information that will be misrepresented into a newspaper as if it's fact and then used to justify changes to the history curriculum by the then Educational Secretary. The effects on the world are not what the people who create this data and not what the people who create the PR stories based on this data have any thought about, unfortunately. And I'm going to finish with this one. So this is an example of what kind of effect this can have and how this data comes about. So here's a question that was in a survey. So I take part in the surveys from time to time. Who do you prefer to work for, men or women? Notice it's a binary choice. You only have men or women. Those are the only 2 options. You have no other options. You don't even have an option to say, actually, it makes no difference to me. I don't believe gender is a really decisive factor when it comes to making a good or bad boss. It's meaningless to me. It doesn't make a difference. You have to choose. If you want your 10 pence, you've got to choose one of those 2 options. So let's say you click the first option you see, men. You then get a list of reasons why men are better bosses. If you prefer to work for a man, why is it? And the reasons are they're easier to reason with. They're more professional. They have no time of the month. They have fewer mood swings. They're more reasonable. These are pre-selected sexist answers that you're forced to choose from in order to make your 10 pence. But let's say you do that. Let's say you choose one of these preset bullshit sexism answers. Your next question is, if you prefer to work for a man, why do you think women make bad bosses? Bad bosses. Now, I never said women make bad bosses. You forced me to pick which makes a better boss, but I might have thought women and men are both brilliant bosses, men slightly edgy because I've only worked for men. Even by answering this question, I am agreeing to your new premise that women make bad bosses. But I want my 10 pence, so I'm going to have to answer something. And when you do that, you look at the options that are available, the pre-selected options to choose from, and they are hormonal. They bitch all the time. They are highly strung. They lie. Just women lie is the reason why women make bad bosses in this preset list of sexist answers. And so I think people don't think about these things too much. They think it's a bit of fun. It's advertised as being a little bit of fun. What they don't realize is it's going to end up in the news as a truism about the world. And here is the Daily Mail, but it also appeared in The Guardian, on 5 Live, The Right Stuff, Loose Women, BBC. It was a subject of phone-ins. And since this story came out in 2010, I've seen this fact regurgitated in several newspaper articles and magazine articles, as research conducted in 2010 found that the vast majority of people think women make bad bosses. And when you read this story and you don't know the genesis of it, you would read it and think, well, clearly, they are hormonal, incapable of leaving their personal lives at home, only too happy to talk about their staff behind their backs. Clearly, this is what people in the survey have said. Clearly, this is a study where someone sat down and said, why do you think women make bad bosses? And these are the responses that people have come up with organically. You wouldn't read this article and think, this is just the list of pre-selected sexist answers you gave the participants, and you've just included whichever ones people ticked. But this then it was an advert for a recruitment consultant just to make you think, well, if women make bad bosses, do I have a good boss? Maybe I should change jobs. That was the only reason this existed. But I've seen this article used to justify why women shouldn't be in positions of authority, why some jobs women just aren't cut out for certain types of jobs. And they've cited this article or statistics from this article as proof. So when it comes to these kind of articles, The PR company who put it together, their only responsibility in their heads, their only accountability or reason for existing is to get their client mentioned in the newspaper. And once this is published, that's job done, game over. They can move on to the next thing, job well done. But once this story is in the newspaper, that's the start of its life for the rest of the world. And if nobody is tracking what effect this has, then it can spiral into places and contribute to the way that we see men and women and the way we see each other in society based on complete bullshit like this. And I'll finish with this. This is literally the last slide now, or pretty much. I always like to challenge people to say, I will buy you a pint if you get this right. I can't do that, but still feel free to answer the question in the chat. You've all learned now how to spot PR, so you should know this. This is a story from The Sun. I want you to fill in the blank here. So at last, guys, what turns women on? And it's not chocolate. So heading off on holiday, it says, is an even bigger turn on for women than sex. A trip away topped the poll to find the most exciting things in a woman's life, followed by becoming a mum. Then it was romping with a loved one, it is The Sun after all, in third, followed by a pay rise in fourth, and what in fifth? What was the fifth most exciting thing in a woman's life, according to this particular study that was obviously clearly very rigorously carried out? I can give you a clue. It's not Jeremy Clarkson nor his penis. That is not the fifth most exciting thing. I'm sure the answers are flooding the text chat right now, but I guarantee none of you got it unless you've seen me talk about this before, which is disappointing because you should obviously have known that it's romping with a loved one in third, a pay rise in fourth, and backing a winner on the horses in fifth. Backing a winner on horses is obviously the fifth most exciting thing in any woman's life, because a horse racing promotion body called Racing for Change carried out a survey of 4,000 housewives that came to that conclusion. And why would a horse racing promotional body lie about something like that? Clearly, this is real research. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm sure there'll be a very robust Q&A. There always is after I give this talk. If you want to find out more, you can see various links there, and I'm sure they'll be posted in the chat. Thank you so much for listening, if indeed you are still listening. And I'll hand you back over to Kat before we go for a break.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Marsh. That was always, as always, an excellent talk. We're now going to take about a 15-minute break so that you've got time to refresh your glasses. And throughout the break, don't forget to keep those questions coming in via Slido, and maybe take some time to put a bet on some horses. We'll be back at 8:25 for the Q&A. Thank you very much. See you in a bit. Welcome back. I hope you're all feeling refreshed and ready for the Q&A. We've had loads of great questions coming in. So we're going to start with the first question from Cleo, who asks, how can we fund good journalism?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question. Sorry, forgive me. I recognise the Skeptics of the audience is very pet friendly, so I've been trying to lure my cat onto the screen because she's not going to be with me for very long because she doesn't like this room. So I was taking one for the Skeptics in the Pub team by feeding my cat treats. This is Mildred. I'll try and get her on screen in a second. But how do you fund good journalism? It's not easy, because obviously if there was an easy way to fix it, someone in the industry really would have done. There's people whose incentives to fix it are far higher than mine. But there's been some good models out there. Partly it's buying newspapers, paying for subscriptions, valuing news. People at the moment think that news should be immediate, accurate and free. And it can't be those things. It used to be the case that the newspapers were essentially, honestly, here is an incomplete list of some things that happened yesterday, described as best as we can. We're going to be wrong, but we'll try and correct anything that's wrong later. These days, it has to be, there is something happening right now. And if you don't know everything about it immediately, then someone else is going to start being the ones to be publishing it as it happens, as breaking news. And you lose the clicks. And if you're not first, immediacy trumps accuracy, and that's a real problem when it comes to the financial model of the newspapers. But a big part of it is buying newspapers, is paying, is rewarding the journalism, rewarding the writing that you value, and valuing it as a service in itself rather than just a thing that you use to fill your Twitter feed, essentially. There's lots of other models that have been attempted. So the Guardian does pretty well out of a subscriber model, where they kind of go for a membership scheme. So if you like what we do, we'll occasionally beg you at the bottom to say, could you be a member? And that seems to work out fairly well from them. There's in some ways, there's traditional models are coming back to the fore. So Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, I think it is. That is old school billionaire philanthropy. That is person who already made their money elsewhere, now wants to own a newspaper for the social status of being a newspaper person, rather than try and make a massive profit out of it. And maybe there's some angle to that. Yeah, there's lots of models being tried. The Telegraph is behind a paywall. I don't think that's particularly valuable. I think it's behind a semi paywall where you can see a couple of articles, which maybe is better than a straight paywall where you don't get to see what happens unless you pay. I'm not a big fan of that model, partly because I think the newspapers that have tried it have seen their readership numbers like decimated, literally in the literal sense of decimated or further, overnight. They may make money out of it, but as a writer, do you really want to be writing to a very small coterie of paying people in a way that no one else can see? I don't know that that's a good model either. If you've got real big truth to tell the world, I don't know that keeping it in a very gate-kept community is the best way to do it. So yeah, I haven't got the answer. I've got a range of answers, and there's a range of other answers out there, but we're still not finding the one that is going to make journalism sustainable into the years to come.
So do you think this sort of push towards like immediate, if inaccurate news has been made worse by Twitter and Facebook and such, or do you think it was already heading in that direction before social media really took off?
No, I think it has been made worse. I think it's been made significantly worse by social media. I think it used to be the case that go back to print newspapers, and you would only buy your own newspaper. Daily Mail readers would by and large read the Daily Mail. Guardian readers would by and large read the Guardian, and very few would ever see in any real substance what was happening in each of the newspapers they didn't read. Then the internet came along and put it all online, and everybody would read everything. And for a while, we kind of broke out of our filter bubbles. But then we started returning back to the websites that we would return back to, and you wouldn't really go and see the Daily Mail unless a friend sent you an article or something like that. And then social media came along, and we started following each other, and people had different tastes, and they would start posting articles from different newspapers, and we broke out of that filter bubble. And then after a while, you'd only start following the people who by and large agreed with you, and you start only really seeing articles in the Daily Mail if you weren't a Daily Mail reader, if somebody was sharing them out of outrage, something like that. So I think we see this kind of new technology comes along, and there's an expansion, and then we find it a way to use it to go back into our silos and contract and things like that. I think where social media has become a real issue is where there are so many different sources of journalism now, and it's actually very difficult for a lot of people to tell what is a credible news outlet and what isn't. OAN, for example, in America looks an awful lot like Fox News, and Fox News looks an awful lot like a credible news outlet. So it's very hard to know exactly, when there's so much of a proliferation of people trying to tell a story. There's so many places to turn to. And when you have that thing of immediacy trumping accuracy, when there's so many more people in the bun fight trying to get the first one to the click, you've got to be the one to try and beat them to it. It was something that the BBC actually published. I think it's actually in Flat Earth News as a memo from the BBC, where for a while they said if something is on the Press Association, you don't need to fact check it. You can consider their copy golden because we need to get it out there. They've actually subsequently retracted that policy, but for a while their stated policy was, we need to be quicker, and therefore just take someone else's word for it, which is a very damaging place for any truth teller, any organization that wants to be seen as a truth teller to be. But that's where we are. That's where we were when the BBC was being pulled into that be quick at all costs model.
Yeah. Okay. Our next question comes from Eagle, and he asks: imagine you have a lot of money and power. How would you go about setting up the media that will prioritize accuracy and truth over whatever the hell they do now?
See, that's a really good question. I think if you had enough money and power that you could just be the sole funding model for a newspaper, that would help. If newspapers didn't have to, or media outlets didn't have to rely on finding other sources of income. So all these things, the various things that I showed in terms of advertising isn't going to fill the gap, and content marketing, Outbrain and places like that, which is that kind of aggregation. These were all just attempts to try and fill the gap that was left by large parts of the funding disappearing overnight. And as I mentioned, one of the things that surprised me most as being the biggest hit, or one of the biggest hits to journalism, was the classified section going, because that was unambiguous source of income that was not ever going to be tied to editorial, because no amount of I'm selling my used Ford Fiesta was ever going to impinge on anything that was happening in the proper part of the newspaper. Once that went away, because I went to Gumtree and eBay and places like that, they really had a headache. And I think actually with The Guardian, I think not a lot of people realise that The Guardian also owned Auto Trader for a long time. And that's where a large source of their income came from, was from Auto Trader and people selling cars in that way. So finding a source of income that is unambiguously untethered from anything that could be editorial is important. That would become a problem, potentially, if I'm the one with all the money and I'm the one saying, this is my newspaper. It's somewhere down the line, you're going to want to start, even without being conscious of it, trying not to piss off the money guy in case the money guy goes away. So the kind of trust models, I think, are very useful. Yeah, I think that's the way to, that's the directions to go. But anytime, the biggest change that they could, that news organizations could do would be to resist the pull of content marketing and content aggregation, and that's a native advertising. That's the biggest thing. So anything that can supplant that income stream so that they don't have to fall in those directions, I think would be a tremendous benefit.
Okay. Our next question comes from Anonymous, and they ask, what are examples of consistently good outlets that monitor the PR and individual journalism? Atlantic, New York Times, Ed Young, etc.
Oh, that's a really good question. I wish I had a really good answer to that. So there used to be some things that did a good job of tracking the worst kind of elements of it. And there used to be a service website called journalism.com, for example, which would look through feeds of press releases and then compare those to the copy on page for all the newspapers and come up with a percentage churn. So it'd say, this story here, well, that came from this press release and it is 80% copied. And we can show you side by side where the chunks of text have come in and where they haven't been changed and things. Unfortunately, that no longer operates, because I think it took a bit of it took up funding to run it, essentially, even though it was sort of self-running. But that was a really good service. But even that had its drawbacks. So one of the things I didn't mention is that there was this absolutely fantastic study done by Bournemouth University that sort of did the opposite to what Cardiff University did. Cardiff University looked at newspapers and journalists and tried to analyse what was happening to journalism. Bournemouth did that to the PR industry with a view to what the PR industry is doing to journalism. Really, really fascinating study, because they talked to lots of people at all different levels of PR and said, when you see a story appear in the newspaper and it's 100% your copy with a different journalist name at the top of it, how do you feel? They're like, I feel really proud that I did my job correctly. I wrote the story as best as that journalist would want it. It fit the newspaper so well. I got my client name mentioned. It's great. And how do you feel from a personal point of view? Oh, fucking terrified. Because now that I know that stories like that end up that way, I can't trust anything that's in there, and I'm really worried about the outcomes for the journalism industry as a whole, knowing what I see. And people were switching between hats. But one of the things they did one of the people that I interviewed was the managing director or the CEO of a major PR company. And it's a PR company that owns market research companies. And reading between the lines, I'm fairly sure it's the one that I've been talking about. I'm very confident of that. And what they said was, well, first of all, we used to put press releases out via our PR company, and we'd see journalists pick up on it. But then after a while, we saw that dry up. And I think that dried up because there was so much competition out there that journalists get sent so much that they sort of went, right, hang on, I'm really going to look at this. So they said, so this MD said, so what we did is we bought a news agency. And so now we put our press releases into the news agency, and the same journalists who stopped taking our press releases directly now publish them from the news agency and don't even ever realize their hours to begin with. So they're even more hands off on it, which I think is fascinating. That's one of the things we're seeing. But the other thing he said in that, I assume it's a he. I know the business, so I'm fairly confident it is. I know the business in question. The other thing they said was there was this website called journalism.com that used to track what percentage of press releases ended up in newspapers. And we used to use it as a sales tool, because we could say to our clients, you see these 5 stories, they were all us. Did you see how the newspapers didn't even change them? That's how good we are. So even the tools that were very effective at tracking how much of an impact journalism had on the news industry were then being used by the very sources of that misinformation as a sales tool to push more misinformation.
Right, so helping to do literally the opposite of what they wanted by setting up that website.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay. Our next question is also from an anonymous asker, and they ask, is there any way to put the genie back in the bottle and stop newspapers relying on news wires and actually do their job?
I wish there was. I really wish there was. I mean, I don't think newspapers relying on news wires is a bad thing, but relying on them as a sole source of copy without ever doing their actual due diligence and doing all the context and actual journalism to it, that's the bad thing. Newspapers have always relied on news wires going back to when a press association, Associated Press and Agence France Presse were started. So that reliance isn't necessarily bad, because stuff occasionally will happen in countries where you're not, and you need to be able to get some on the ground information. And there's other kind of, there's news agencies from certain industries. That's a good way of understanding what's going on in that industry, if you then go ahead and do the journalism. So the way to put the genie back in the bottle isn't to divorce newspapers from the newswire, but to reinsert that layer of editorializing, that layer of journalism. And that's what's getting thinner and thinner. And how we put that genie back in the bottle, I think, really does come back down to the financial model. I think there are some signs that there are a few more jobs knocking around in journalism than there used to be. I think that the contraction has stopped and has maybe started in some places to go the other way. It used to be the case, for example, that on a Saturday at the Daily Star, there'd be like 3 journalists working there, and they'd be freelancers. And part of their job was to look at the Daily Mail on Friday and see which stories they could regurgitate. So a lot of newspapers had a much thinner staffing than you might imagine, because you assume these are big totemic titles, they'd be really well staffed. But if you leaf through a copy of some of those newspapers, you'll see the same names appearing time and again. So yeah, but having more opportunities for people to go into journalism, I think will and actual jobs for them to land in, I think will be important. You look at the Mail Online, for example, a lot of journalists will start out at the Mail Online because they'll finish their journalism degree, they'll go to the Daily Mail, they'll do a year kind of conversion course, and then they'll be an online reporter for the Mail Online, churning out 6 or 7 stories a day. And then after they've been there for a while, they might leave and go somewhere else. But it still means that the bulk of the stuff being done by the Mail Online is being done by incredibly junior people who are not in a position to push back against an editor saying, you will push this story out. So one of the other ways you put the genie back in the bottle is for the more senior people in the industry to take responsibility for the effect of the cumulative effect of their industry. You could be the science editor at the Daily Mail and do a fantastic job, and they do some pretty good stuff. The science editor of the Telegraph and the health editor of the Telegraph do fantastic stuff. They're very, very good at what they do, but they see that they are apart from the day-to-day of the newspaper, which is pushing out loads of misinformation and pushing out loads of bullshit, in my opinion. Tying together the more senior positions in the newspaper to the realities of what the bulk of the newspaper is doing, I think is or at least those more senior people taking some responsibility. I don't just mean the health editor, but generally speaking, that editorial level, taking more responsibility for what's going out in the newspaper more broadly, I think would really help as well.
Okay. We have another anonymous question. And they ask, do you see a difference in the media in countries or areas where there is government support to newspapers and TV compared to where there is not?
Oh, blimey, that's another really good question. And it's probably one that's beyond my bounds of expertise, because I really only spend my time looking at the British press, because that's the world that I know and the world that I work adjacent to, with the stuff that I do with Good Thinking and the amount of press coverage and things that we get there. I can say that I've given this talk all around the world. I've given it in Sweden to a European audience made of people from different countries around Europe. I've given it in Brazil. I've given it in Australia. And wherever I've given it, there's been local journalists who said, yes, that's it. That is the thing that's happening. You've absolutely captured it. And I've had journalists then saying, "So what do we do about it?" So, "Oh, I'm not even a journalist. I don't know. I'm not. If I could fix it, I wouldn't be stood here. I'd be, hired as a consultant for some of the biggest newspapers around." So I don't know that that there would be a huge difference. I mean, obviously here in the UK we have got like the BBC, for example, which obviously has a lot of independence commercially and some responsibilities as a result of that. And by and large, the BBC are better than most of the newspapers, but they're still susceptible to, or they have been susceptible to some of the same issues. So there was a time that you could see police press releases would be reported in the local BBC pretty much verbatim. So whatever the police said happened is what would get reported without a single word being changed. And that's a worry, because I'm not someone who will say that, every time the police say anything, they're wrong. But there's definitely some pretty high profile cases where the police have given the wrong side of things or given a spin on things that isn't reflective of reality. And what you've needed has been a robust press to push back against that. And the BBC being commercially uninvested in the sense that it's kind of funded through license payer, should have been that robust press and should not have been acting essentially as the mouthpiece of the police. And we've seen, I think it was the Forest Gate, I think was the issue. This wasn't a BBC story, but it was those a police raid on a flat in London, I think it was Forest Gate, where it found two brothers were making a bomb, and then in the confusion, one of the brothers shot the other brother, and that was a story that ran everywhere immediately afterwards. And then months later, once the investigation, the IPCC had been concluded, it was revealed that there was never a bomb, and it was the police who shot one of the brothers, and it was just their press release that put out their version of events, and that's the one that stood for a long time. So we need a robust press to be able to challenge that, those positions of extreme authority, and we don't always have that. But yeah, going back to the original question, I haven't personally seen a huge difference in different countries, but that's because I've spent the majority of my time looking at the way the media works in the UK, really.
Yeah, and it links back to something you said earlier of like, there's always the worry of pissing off the money man. Like it almost doesn't, like, whether it's the government or public purse or Jeff Bezos funding it, that's always going to be on the mind of the reporters. And like it must be very difficult to figure out a foolproof way of getting away from that.
Yeah, and so there was a story I was told by a former Daily Star reporter that one day they had, and this is a Daily Star, it's a very, very tabloid level story. One day a supermarket was found to have, a customer at a supermarket found a dead mouse in one of their boxes of their own brand cornflakes. And that's a classic Daily Star type of story. You hold up the mouse, you hold up the cornflakes, you look glum, you do the angry people in newspapers pointing at things. And it was set to go out for a full page, basically. And at the last second, the page was pulled because the supermarket bought an advert in the newspaper that was a full page. And that is a very low level illustration of how that commercial consequence of news can have an influence and an impact on your ability to tell the truth. Now, it's not the biggest truth in the world to say that pack of cornflakes had a mouse in it, but the illustrative value is there, I think.
Yeah, I suppose we're seeing a little bit of stuff going the other way with campaigns like Stop Funding Hate, where people are getting in touch with supermarkets and places like that and saying, stop paying for adverts in this horrible newspaper or on this terrible news TV site.
Yeah, and I find those campaigns really interesting. I find the backlash to those campaigns really interesting, like the idea that it is a new thing that people would take issue with what a newspaper was saying and then would start to challenge the commerciality of that newspaper as a result. Like that hasn't been happening forever. It's just mostly been happening by the people who had the money. So it used to be the case that if you pissed off, if you said something that a particularly large business didn't like, they would be influential enough to pick up the phone and say, you need to stop your reporters doing that, or they would pull the advertising that they had, and that's how they would exert a bit of influence. Now, when it's something that's being done by the people who are reading rather than the people who are paying the checks, it's suddenly cancel culture, free speech gone mad, like it hasn't always been there, but just not overt and not transparent.
Well, it's only worrying when the proles do it.
That is always the case. That is absolutely the case. Yeah.
Our next question is from Igor, and he asks, it looks like social media and social journalism are going to murder classical media and eat it for breakfast. If it's true, do you see that as a good thing?
I don't know necessarily that it's true. I think there's ways that that the two can work quite well together. So I remember I was reading Alan Rusbridge's book, the former editor of The Guardian. He was saying one of the things the Guardian, I say this is going to sound like an absolute Guardian Easter. I do subscribe to The Guardian, but that's probably not a surprise to anyone. But one of the things he was saying that the Guardian did that in order to try and embrace that that extra digital world was to essentially spend a bit more time crowdsourcing, to spend a bit more time saying, well, ordinarily the model was we know everything and here is the truth. But they started to recognize that now there was a bit more of a two-way conversation. The people you were talking to often would know, the people you were broadcasting to or you know printing for often would know more than you, and you can take advantage of that by saying, here's what we are, here's what we understand about this, and we're looking for more information on these things from people who are experts in those areas. And we see that happening with journalists on social media. I also think traditional newspapers have in a way, social media has been a real boon for traditional newspapers, as well as the pressures it's put on, because the flip side of it is it's so much easier to get to who's in some stories. So it used to be the case if there was, you know, a bunch of anti-vax knobheads putting sticker graffitis all around your town, how would you ever have found that out 20 years ago? You maybe would have found it incredibly difficult. But these days you can follow their social media, find out who they are, actually reach out to them, maybe even get to talk to them, maybe even get to figure out who they are from what they're saying online, and therefore piece together the story in a much more cost-effective and quicker way, and get more depth than you would have had. You see things like, obviously we've had Elliot Higgins from Bellingcat. Obviously that's not traditional media, but traditional media has done reasonably well sort of working to co-report or pick up on some of the reports that digital places and social places like Bellingcat have done a lot of the groundwork on. So there's models out there. I remember James Burke, who used to be he worked at WikiLeaks at one point and then was working for The Guardian for quite a while, and he's now at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. He was pointing out that the cost involved in a lot of journalism, while a lot of the income in journalism has significantly gone down in the last couple of decades, a lot of the costs have also gone down, in that it's now possible to search records in seconds that would have taken weeks of reading through line after line after line to find visually what you're looking for. You can fire off 20 FOI requests, freedom of information requests, to 20 different bodies from the comfort of your chair, and have answers back on the timeline specified, rather than having to physically write on bits of paper and then put those in envelopes and stamps and all that kind of thing. So some of the effort that goes into that side of things has significantly reduced, partly through digital media generally, and partly through social media. So I don't think social media journalism is a massive challenge to journalism, because the best journalists will continue to work, and they'll work with those tools and integrate them into what they're doing for more mainstream publications.
Yeah, whenever like we talk about bad PR and bad journalism things, like it always makes me think about Marion Jones and the fact that like there are still some like very good journalists doing some incredibly good work out there.
Oh yeah,
so I like huge. Yeah, like I sort of wonder whether like one way of improving journalism is by like really talking up those people that are doing a fantastic job and making good investigative journalism almost a prestige job. But
yeah, no, so I think that's definitely the case, and I think in many places it still is a prestige job. So you know, the Insight team at the Sunday Times, I think it was, there was a really famous investigative journalism team whose exact home I've forgotten right now. It's a very prestigious, the work that you do will be incredibly prestigious. Investigative journalism, I think, is actually one of the things that hasn't really been hit and hasn't lost any of its shine and hasn't really been challenged. I think it's the day-to-day stuff of, because the investigative journalism is all about kind of where are the big important stories that need to be brought to light, and the deep truths that need to be brought forth. And I think that stuff will always have a role, and there'll always be places that want to be associated with that kind of painstaking research, painstaking work. I think it's the more day-to-day stuff of how does the world actually work at a normal level. That's the side of journalism that I think is most likely to suffer. It's not the really in-depth kind of what is happening, the is the NSA spying on everyone kind of stuff. That stuff will always happen. It's the what happened yesterday in Afghanistan kind of stuff, and what happened yesterday in Croydon Town Council. That's the kind of stuff that I think is more likely to be challenged by the way that journalism currently works.
Yeah, I think when I sort of say like it being a prestige job, like I was more thinking to the point where those people are household names, I guess. Because I'd wager most people don't actually know who Marion Jones is, and it's only through QED and through various skeptics in the pub groups that I know who he is.
Yeah, but lots of people would know, like TV reporter, investigative journalists, a lot more. So I think someone like Marion Jones, who's absolutely fantastic, has always been a producer, and people don't typically know producers. They know the on-screen talent and the person who puts their name at the top and the bottom of the articles. So I think, yeah, there's always those figures who do a huge amount of the work, but their role has never been the one that garners acclaim. It always goes to the person who's stood in front of the camera reading the words out.
Yeah. Okay. Our next question comes from Mara Bell. And they ask, I go to Private Eye and Twitter for news. Where else do you recommend?
Oh, God, all these questions are great. And I'm terribly worried I'm going to give wholly
It's the SitP-O audience.
It is. It's a fantastic audience. I'm I'm terrified I'm going to give wholly inadequate answers. One thing I would say is I try to follow news from sources that don't agree with me as well. So Private Eye is obviously fantastic. I take issue with, not necessarily take issue, I'd be wary about considering going to Twitter for news. And this is only in the sense of when I've given this kind of lecture to journalism students, one of the things that has come up is that even students at university studying journalism, when asked what sources of news do you read, they come back with Facebook or Twitter, which aren't sources of news. Those are just the way that you got the news that was out there. The sources of news is the person who's passing along the article from the New York Times. The source is the New York Times, not the person who's aggregating it. Those people are essentially aggregators. They're the outbrain or taboola of social networks. And so I don't really like thinking about Twitter as a source of news. It's a place where you go where news is discussed, and it's a useful place for discovering that news. But yeah, but one of the things I would always recommend is trying to look to the sources of news that you wouldn't be normally drawn to. Not because you'll necessarily learn a whole lot of truth that you wouldn't have otherwise seen, but at least you get to see the perspective on it that you wouldn't have seen, and therefore what people who don't see the stuff you see are saying about it, and that can be quite useful. But if you want me to, I'm not sure I could just name a website and say this is where I'd go for news. I don't have that in me, I'm afraid.
All right. Our next question again comes from Igor, and he asks regarding all that misleading polls, why do they do them in the first place? What's stopping them from just inventing any data they want?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I think if you don't just invent the data, but you actually do conduct the research, it isn't wrong. It's meaningless, but it's not wrong. It's not made up because you can point people to the charts and things like that. Also, the way there's an entire industry built up around it. So if you look at One Poll, and One Poll is the market research company. 72 Point is a PR company. Southwest News Service is the news agency. They're all owned by the same business that handles all the different channels of it. Where the money comes from in that regard is the client who wants their name mentioned in the press. Now, if you just said, we're going to write a story about you and we're going to put some numbers in it, that client may think, well, that sounds bullshit to me. Or they may think, well, I'm not going to pay very much for that because you're just going to spend your time making stuff up. If you say, we're going to talk to our dedicated panel of 100,000 people to find 2,000 people who are the hyper-focused, targeted respondents who are exactly the right demographic for you, and we're going to ask them this series of questions, then we're going to mine that data and spin it and pick out the data and pick out the interesting bits and present it in infographic and do this, that's a lot more sellable. And so that's where the income stream for those companies comes from. The income stream isn't getting the thing in the newspaper, it's the person who pays them to do that. And so I think that's why they do generate that data. But when you come back to questions like that, that story about whose cooking do you prefer, for example, that story could have gone either way, regardless of the data. I prefer, men prefer their mum's cooking, men prefer their wives' cooking. It's the same story, but with the name switched. But the only way that story gets into the press is if you can put the nouns in and the numbers in. You can write the entire thing and say, we found that X% of men preferred Y's cooking. You need to fill those in and point. And if a journalist can see a PDF with a couple of charts in it, then they're more likely to think, well, this is proper research rather than just a story I've been sent. There are people who will just make it up. But what's interesting to me about so as I mentioned about how journalism contracted in terms of the number of people working in journalism got smaller, there's fewer and fewer jobs. Where do those people go who are well trained at knowing how to write for newspapers, but no longer have a job writing for newspapers? They go into PR. They go into the industries that want people who know how to write for newspapers, writing for them to give stuff to newspapers. So as the journalism industry shrinks, the PR industry gets bigger. And so you get more and more people, more and more agencies of different types. And so as you do that, you sort of see PR stratifying into the ones who'll be really good, who'll be having personal relationships with journalists and never actually have to tell them what I want you to do. Is just me and I'm the person to go to on stuff like that. And you get your stuff that way. Then you'll have the strata of people who will just fire off press releases to a few journalists that they've worked with before. And here's 50 stories a week that I'm going to send you. And then you'll have those who just fire, the strata below that, who can't make those personal connections because they're not in a big enough agency or aren't quite as good or whatever reason, who will just fire off shotgun thousands of emails out to thousands of people, whatever email address they can get that's associated with the newspaper, and hope someone picks up on it. That's the ones who are good enough to target newspapers. Then you get the ones below that who know we can't get in a newspaper anymore because those are awash with too many contacts. But there's loads of people who've got blogs. And if what we really want is for our client website to rise in Google ranking by having lots of different links to our client, we don't need the Daily Mail to send it across to us. If we can just find like 50 blogs to link to us instead, that'll have a similar impact. So I'm just going to find anybody who's got a website and say, I'd like to write an article for you. How much would you charge for me to write an article for you? And anybody who owns a website will get loads and loads of those. And that, I think, is the lower level of PR that can't even aim high enough to pitch to newspapers. They're just finding any random blogger. And those are the people who I think probably do just make it up because the numbers involved are so small. The amount of income for outlay is so small that it's not worth actually putting out real stories. You might as well just generate bullshit. So they're a whole other piece of the picture.
But presumably, even with the stuff that, like, with the not made up but completely pointless numbers, presumably everyone at every stage of the process knows what's going on, or has at least a reasonable inclination. And so it's just possibly a case of having plausible deniability of like, well, I was shown this survey result. Or
I don't know if they know. I think they know, but they don't know. No, it's not their job to hold it in mind. So, yeah. Like when it comes to the people, if you track every stage of it, the people who are involved in actually taking the surveys, they looked on Money Saving Expert, the Martin Lewis website, said, here's a fun way of making an extra bit of pocket money from the comfort of your own home. It's just a laugh. It's just a bit of fun. It doesn't matter. And so those people are just kind of saying, well, I'm going to fill in a lot of these market research surveys, and maybe the stuff that I'm saying will be useful to someone, but I know I'll get paid for it. And okay, maybe I'm not quite eligible for this one, but I'm so close to 40 quid that I'm going to take it anyway. Or I'm so far away from 40 quid and I've only got 2 that I can take today, that this third one and this fourth one, is it really going to be that harmful if I just take part? It's just meant to be a bit of fun. So I'm just going to take part. It's a bit of fun. It doesn't matter where it goes. And the PR companies will know that that's what's happening. And they'll know that, all right, if I put questions in this, if I get to question 16 and put the answer that I want first, people are going to click it. And the ones who are going to be quickest through and who aren't thinking about it are most likely to get there first, to answer it first, to click it first. So I can really bias this in that way. And I'm not doing it to be malicious, but I know full well that if I get a really eye-catching headline out of this, my client is going to be so happy. And the journalist is more likely to print it. So yeah, it's probably not that legit, but there's lots of people who take part who probably are saying something that makes sense. So it's probably still fine. And this is just a bit of fun. I'm just getting my client's name mentioned in the press. And then that story goes to a newspaper and so, well, look, I might have done some good journalism today, but I need to fill a story. And I've been sent some loads and loads and loads of shit. But this one, I mean, it's saying something that's probably true. Like maybe men do prefer their mums cooking to their wives cooking. That sounds like something I've heard before, right? So is that so bad? And what's the harm of it? It's not going to make a difference. Maybe women don't make the greatest bosses. And the headline in here, the figures in here are really eye-catching. And the stuff they've come up with, well, they can't have just written that list and given it to people. That must have been what people have said. So there must have been some real research gone into this, right? So yeah, it's not the best piece of journalism in the world, but it fills me quota, and I don't feel dirty about doing it. So that goes out. In no case along that way does anyone think, what does this story mean in the world? Yeah. What impact will this story have on the world? Will this story change the way anybody thinks about women as bosses? Will this story be used later when some misogynist arsehole is arguing that women shouldn't be in positions of authority and is using this story and 3 others like it to argue that there's loads of data supporting his point? It's nobody's job to think that way, because the job of the PR person is just get your name in the press and move on. The job of the journalist is just publish the article and go on to the next one. You've got 6 more to write today and another 7 tomorrow. And then it's also that who's doing this? Who in the organizations is doing this? It's not the editor of the Daily Mail who's publishing that story. It's not even the news editor, the breaking news editor. It's most likely to be your just out of university, done a year's conversion course, is on the Mail Online doing filler work journalist, who's not the one who's on whose shoulders the ethics and morality of journalism ought to be decided. And in the PR company, well, you know full well, if it's not the managing director of the PR company or the key account manager of the PR company who's doing those stories, it's the junior account exec, it's the account exec, it's the entry level positions. And you know full well that if I find a men versus women angle in this story, it's way more likely to generate an eye-catching result that's more likely to get people to read it, which means it's more likely to go in the newspapers. And okay, maybe it's not great to be generating what is probably dodgy data, or maybe I don't know enough to know it's dodgy, but maybe it's a bit dodgy data. It's not great to be doing that, but ultimately I'm just trying to show my manager that I'm good at what I do in order to succeed in this career. The ethics and responsibility and accountability of all of the PR industry shouldn't rest on a junior account executive's shoulders. So I think, yeah, it's nobody's job to think about the implications of it all, or to think about whether it's true or not, because everybody's just turning their wheel the way they're meant to be turning it, but the whole machine is going backwards and off a cliff.
Yeah, and the process is so fast that nobody really has time to actually sit and reflect.
Yeah, and the people who do have the time to sit and reflect are sitting reflecting on other things.
Yeah. Okay, we've got another anonymous question, and they ask, is the idea that journalism has ever been about truth a myth, apart from a few exceptions? Paul Foote, John Pilger, now I'm struggling.
Again, I think it depends at what level. I think by and large, I'm by and large optimistic or positive about journalism as an industry. I think most people go into journalism because they want to find ways of telling interesting, important stories. I don't think anybody goes into journalism to say, I want to be a tool of propaganda. I want to generate nothing but spin and bullshit in order to stoke fear and division. Even journalists who work for newspapers that do that don't start off in journalism to do that, and even don't necessarily think that that's what they, that isn't what they want to be doing. So you look at someone like Rich Pepiat, who was a journalist at the Daily Star for a long time, who was the one the Daily Star would send out dressed in a burqa to see how people would react, and the one who the Daily Star would send out to do these kind of stunt journalism pieces. And he was just trying to pay his rent until he realized one day, actually, this is horrible, and I don't want to support any of this. And then quit the Daily Star and published his resignation letter in The Guardian. But I don't doubt that there weren't several other younger, less experienced Rich Pepiats ready to take his place. And all you need is a constant stream of people not yet disillusioned, who still think that they're going to hit a high ideal of journalism at some point in their career, and this is just a stepping stone. You just need to keep burning through those people in order to carry on pushing propaganda through newspapers, because the vast majority of what you write won't be that. Most of the stuff in the Daily Mail isn't hate propaganda. Most of the stuff in the Daily Express isn't denying climate change or anything awful. But the headline pieces will be. But the day-to-day stuff is, Bexley Town Council's approved a new A road to go through with a roundabout past the school. That's your day-to-day of it. So I think most journalists want to be telling the truth. And in a lot of what journalists will choose to be writing, and the stories that they would traditionally find would be mostly solid bits, I would say, with the occasional stuff that would then be either spun by a sub-editor or pushed from on high and that kind of thing. But I just think now we're in a position where most journalists don't leave their desk. We're when you think of journalists, you think about the person who's at the scene of the crime, who's at the scene of the crash, who's stood outside the hospital reporting, who's talking to eyewitnesses. And that isn't what most journalists do now, because any moment you're not at your desk is a moment you're not typing.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're basically coming to the end now, so I'm going to just have one more question for you. And this comes from Dave Jenkins. And he asks, you say that you take part in these polls every now and again. Have you ever been able to cash out? And if so, what did you do with that sweet one poll money?
So I think I might have cashed out once, maybe a long time ago. But I think while this is the hilarious question to end on, actually this tells, I think, a really important thing that I didn't get to. I think the vast majority of people get disillusioned and don't cash out. I think the fact that you've got to spend 3, 4, 5 minutes on a survey 400 times before you make 40 quid. Think of what your hourly rate is there. It's incredibly low. I think most people get to maybe 15, 20 quid, find doing 2 or 3 surveys a day annoying, lose it after a while, which means functionally, someone like OnePoll sells their stories to their clients and their outlay is almost nil, because the people they're charging, the people they're paying to do their market research never make that money. So you never have to pay anybody. So even the people who are just doing it because it's just 10 pence never actually see that 10 pence. The people who said, women are bad bosses because they lie, never got that 10 pence in many of the cases. So I think I did get the 40 quid out at one point. I'm gonna trust my past self now that I can't remember and say I probably donated it to a worthy cause. I'm not going to say whether that worthy cause was a charity or whether it was me for having put up with having sifted through so much bullshit to get to that point. But I put it to good use, I would say.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for the talk and for the Q&A. I could have happily kept that going for quite a bit longer. But obviously, we'll have other things to do and polls to take. And so thank you to everyone in the audience for joining tonight, and everyone who's submitted or upvoted questions that allowed us to do that great Q&A. We're now doing talks every other week instead of weekly. So next week we won't have a talk, but we will have the lock-ins Razor open. So there'll still be that social element available for anyone who wants it. And then the week after, we're going to be joined by Faye Skelton, I think, who's going to be talking to us about why some people make false confessions to crimes that they didn't commit. So that's likely to be a really interesting talk. I might have got the name wrong, but I definitely got the topic right. And other than that, it's just thank you to the behind the scenes team that have brought us to you tonight. And thanks once again for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you soon. Bye.